The small town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was a quiet, peaceful community where nothing much ever happened. That's why, when 18-year-old Elara Voss disappeared on a crisp October morning, the entire town was thrown into chaos. Elara was a bright, ambitious young woman with dreams of becoming a journalist. She had a reputation for being responsible and reliable, which made her sudden disappearance all the more alarming. Her parents, Mira and Jovan Voss, were frantic. Elara had left the house early that morning to catch the bus to college, but she never arrived. By midday, her worried parents had called everyone they could think of, friends, teachers, even the bus driver, but no one had seen her. The police were called and a search began immediately. Elara's phone was found near a park just a few blocks from her house. The screen was cracked and the battery was dead. It was a chilling discovery, as though she had vanished into thin air. The park was searched thoroughly, but there was no sign of a struggle or any clues as to where she might have gone. The police began to piece together her last known movements, but the trail went cold quickly. Elara had been seen walking toward the bus stop, but after that, nothing. It was as if she had been plucked from the streets without a trace. As the hours turned into days, the town's anxiety grew. Flyers with Elara's photo were posted everywhere, and volunteers joined the search parties scouring the surrounding woods and fields. The local news picked up the story, and soon the case was making headlines across the region. Elara's face was everywhere, her bright smile and piercing green eyes haunting the community. People began to speculate. Had she run away? It seemed unlikely. Elara was close to her family and had been excited about her future. Was it a kidnapping? The thought sent shivers through the town. Willow Creek wasn't the kind of place where things like that happened. But as the days passed with no sign of her, the unthinkable began to feel like the only explanation. One detail stood out in the early days of the investigation. A neighbor, Mrs. Talia Greer, reported seeing a dark blue van parked near Elara's house the morning she disappeared. Mrs. Greer hadn't thought much of it at the time. Vans weren't uncommon in the area, but in hindsight it seemed suspicious. She couldn't recall the license plate or the driver's face, but the van had been there, idling quietly around the time Elara left for the bus stop. The police followed up on the lead, but without more information it was a dead end. Still, the van became a focal point in the investigation, a tiny thread of hope in an otherwise hopeless case. As the days turned into weeks, the initial frenzy began to die down. The search parties grew smaller and the news coverage shifted to other stories. But for Elara's family, the nightmare was far from over. Mira and Jovan refused to give up hope, clinging to the belief that their daughter was still alive. They held vigils, gave interviews, and pleaded with the public for any information that might lead to her. The town of Willow Creek, once a place of comfort and safety, now felt like a shadow of its former self. The disappearance of Elara Voss had changed everything, leaving behind a community haunted by questions and fear. Little did they know the truth was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. While the town of Willow Creek was consumed with worry over Elara's disappearance, a man named Cale Mercer was going about his life as if nothing had happened. To everyone who knew him, Cale was the picture of normalcy. He was a 38-year-old mechanic, married with 2 young children, and well-liked in the community. He coached his son's Little League team, helped his daughter with her homework, and always had a friendly smile for his neighbors. But beneath this facade of a devoted family man, Cale harbored a dark and dangerous secret. Cale had always been good at hiding his true nature. He had a knack for blending in, for appearing trustworthy and kind. But in reality, he was a man consumed by obsession and control. For months, he had been fixated on Elara Voss. He first noticed her at the local grocery store, where she worked part-time as a cashier. There was something about her youth, her innocence, her vibrant energy, that drew him in. Over time, his interest turned into an unhealthy obsession. He began to follow her, learning her routines and habits. He knew what time she left for college, which route she took to the bus stop, and even where she liked to study in the park. To Elara, he was just another face in the crowd, but to Cale, she was everything. Cale's double life was meticulously planned. He had a dark blue van that he used for work, but it also served as the perfect vehicle for his sinister activities. He had modified the interior, adding soundproofing and reinforced locks, ensuring that no one would hear or see what happened inside. He also owned a remote cabin deep in the woods, inherited from his late uncle. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by miles of dense forest and far from prying eyes. It was the perfect place to carry out his twisted plans without interruption. On the morning of Elara's disappearance, Cale had been waiting. He knew her routine by heart and had chosen the perfect moment to strike. As she walked toward the bus stop, he pulled up beside her in the van, offering her a ride. Elara, recognizing him as a familiar face from the neighborhood, hesitated but ultimately agreed. It was a decision that would change her life forever. Once she was inside the van, Cale used a cloth soaked in chloroform to render her unconscious. He drove her to the cabin, where he had prepared a room specifically for her. A room with no windows, a heavy metal door, and chains attached to the bed. Cale's actions were calculated and precise. He had thought of everything, from the supplies he would need to keep Elara alive to the alibis that would protect him from suspicion. He even made sure to maintain his normal routine, going to work, attending his children's school events, and acting as though nothing was amiss. To the outside world, Cale Mercer was a loving husband and father, but in the shadows he was a predator, a man capable of unspeakable cruelty. As the days passed, Cale grew more confident. He believed he had covered his tracks perfectly, that no one would ever connect him to Elara's disappearance. But even the most careful criminals make mistakes, and Cale was no exception. Little did he know, his carefully constructed world was about to unravel, and the truth of his double life would soon be exposed. Elara's first moments of consciousness in the cabin were a blur of confusion and terror. Her head throbbed, her vision was hazy, and her body felt heavy as though weighed down by an invisible force. As her senses slowly returned, she realized she was lying on a cold, hard surface. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and something metallic. She tried to move, but her wrists and ankles were bound by heavy chains, the cold metal biting into her skin. Panic surged through her as she struggled to remember how she had ended up here. The last thing she recalled was getting into a van with a man she thought she could trust. Now, she was trapped in a nightmare. The cabin was a grim, oppressive space. The walls were bare, the floor uneven, and the only source of light came from a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room had no windows, and the heavy metal door was bolted shut from the outside. Elara's heart raced as she took in her surroundings, her mind scrambling to make sense of the situation. She called out for help, but her voice echoed back at her, unanswered. The realization that she was completely alone, with no one to hear her cries, was suffocating. Days passed, though Elara had no way of keeping track of time. Cale visited her regularly, bringing food and water but offering no comfort or explanation. His presence was a constant source of fear. Sometimes he would sit and watch her in silence, his cold, calculating eyes studying her every move. Other times he would speak in a calm, almost soothing tone, telling her that no one was looking for her, that she was forgotten. He wanted to break her spirit, to make her believe that escape was impossible, but Elara refused to give in to despair. Deep down, she clung to the hope that someone, somewhere, was searching for her. During one of Cale's visits, Elara noticed something unusual. As he moved around the room, she caught a glimpse of a loose floorboard near the bed. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough to spark an idea in her mind. If she could find a way to pry it open, there might be something underneath. A tool, a weapon, anything that could help her escape. She waited until Cale left, then began to search the room for anything she could use. Her eyes landed on a piece of broken cutlery that had been left on the tray with her food. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Working carefully and quietly, Elara used the broken utensil to pry at the loose floorboard. It was slow, painstaking work and her hands ached from the effort, but she didn't give up. Finally, after what felt like hours, the board came loose. Beneath it, she found a small, rusted key. Her heart leapt with hope, but it was quickly tempered by reality. The key didn't fit the chains that bound her, nor did it fit the door. Still, it was a sign that there might be other secrets hidden in the cabin, other ways to fight back. Elara's discovery gave her a renewed sense of determination. She began to pay closer attention to her surroundings, looking for anything that might help her. She noticed that the walls were lined with old, weathered wood, some of which seemed to be loose or damaged. She also spotted a faint outline on one of the walls, as though something had been concealed behind it. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could there be a hidden compartment, a way out? She didn't know, but she was willing to try anything. As the days dragged on, Elara's resolve only grew stronger. She knew that Cale was watching her closely, so she had to be careful. She began to feign submission, pretending to be broken and defeated in order to lower his guard. It was a dangerous game, but it was her only chance. She bided her time, waiting for the right moment to make her move. The key she had found was a small victory, but it was enough to keep her going. She knew that if she could just hold on a little longer, she might find a way to escape the nightmare she was trapped in. The cabin, once a symbol of her captivity, was slowly becoming a puzzle for her to solve. Every creak of the floorboards, every crack in the walls held the potential for freedom. Elara's mind was sharp, her instincts honed by fear and desperation. She was no longer just a victim, she was a fighter, determined to outwit her captor and reclaim her life. And as she lay in the dim light of that grim room, she vowed to herself that she would not die in this place. She would find a way out, no matter what it took. Back in Willow Creek, the investigation into Elara's disappearance had hit a wall. Despite the tireless efforts of the police and the community, there were no new leads. The dark blue van, reported by Mrs. Greer, had seemingly vanished, and without a license plate or a clear description of the driver, the trail had gone cold. But just as hope was beginning to fade, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An anonymous tip was called into the police hotline, claiming that a dark blue van matching the description had been seen near the woods on the outskirts of town on the day Elara went missing. The caller didn't leave a name, but the information was enough to reignite the investigation. Detectives began to focus their efforts on the area where the van had reportedly been seen. They combed through traffic camera footage, interviewed residents, and even brought in search dogs to scour the woods. It was slow, painstaking work, but they were determined to find any clue that might lead them to Elara. Meanwhile, Cale Mercer was growing increasingly paranoid. He had always been careful, meticulous in covering his tracks, but the sudden surge of police activity near the woods made him nervous. He began to make mistakes, small but significant ones that would eventually lead to his downfall. One of those mistakes was a receipt found in his trash. It was for a purchase made at a hardware store near the cabin, a purchase that included items like chains, locks, and soundproofing materials. The receipt was dated just a week before Elara's disappearance, and it raised red flags for the detectives. Why would a mechanic need such items? They began to dig deeper into Cale's life, uncovering inconsistencies in his alibi and strange behavior that didn't align with his image as a devoted family man. His wife, Lila, mentioned that he had been acting strangely lately, staying out late and making odd excuses for his whereabouts. She had dismissed it as stress from work, but now she wasn't so sure. As the police closed in, Cale's paranoia reached a breaking point. He started to visit the cabin more frequently, checking on Elara and reinforcing the locks and chains. He was convinced that he was untouchable, that he had planned everything too perfectly to be caught, but his arrogance was his undoing. During one of his visits, he left behind a muddy boot print in the cabin, a print that matched the soil from the woods near Willow Creek. It was a small detail, but it was enough to connect him to the location. Meanwhile, Elara was growing bolder. She had found the hidden compartment behind the loose floorboard and discovered a map of the area, along with a handwritten note from Cale's uncle. The note detailed an escape route through the woods, a path that led to a nearby road. It was a risky plan, but it was her only chance. She began to prepare, hiding the map and the key in a safe place and waiting for the right moment to make her move. She knew that Cale was becoming more erratic, more careless, and she hoped that his mistakes would give her the opportunity she needed. The tension was building, both in the cabin and in the town. The police were closing in on Cale, and Elara was preparing to fight for her freedom. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but time was running out. The question was no longer if the truth would come out, but when, and whether it would be in time to save Elara. The night of Elara's escape was moonless, the forest cloaked in an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow every sound. Cale had arrived at the cabin earlier than usual, his movements hurried and his demeanor tense. He barely spoke to Elara, his mind clearly elsewhere as he checked the locks and chains with a frantic energy. Elara could sense his unease, and she knew this might be her only chance. She waited until he left, her heart pounding as she listened to the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. The moment she was sure he was gone, she sprang into action. Using the broken piece of cutlery she had hidden, Elara worked quickly to free herself from the chains. Her hands trembled, but her determination kept her focused. The key she had found didn't fit the locks, but it did open the hidden compartment in the wall where she had discovered the map. She grabbed it along with a small flashlight she had managed to steal during one of Cale's visits and slipped out of the room. The cabin was eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. Elara moved cautiously, her every step deliberate and quiet. She knew Cale could return at any moment, and the thought sent a shiver down her spine. Following the map, Elara made her way through the dense woods. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and twisted trees, but the map guided her toward a narrow path that led to a road. Her bare feet ached as they scraped against roots and rocks, but she pushed through the pain, driven by sheer willpower. The flashlight's beam was weak, but it was enough to keep her on track. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made her heart race, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Freedom was within reach. Hours later, exhausted and disheveled, Elara stumbled onto the road. The first light of dawn was breaking on the horizon, casting a pale glow over the landscape. She collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with relief and exhaustion. Moments later, a truck appeared in the distance. Elara waved her arms frantically, her voice hoarse from shouting. The driver, an older man named Hank, pulled over immediately. He took one look at Elara, her torn clothes, her haunted eyes, and knew something was terribly wrong. He helped her into the truck and called the police. Back in Willow Creek, the police were already closing in on Cale. The evidence against him had mounted, and a warrant had been issued for his arrest. When officers arrived at his home, they found him packing a bag, clearly preparing to flee. He was taken into custody without resistance, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of his crimes. The cabin was searched, and the horrors within were laid bare. Chains, tools, and other disturbing items were found, along with evidence linking Cale to another unsolved disappearance from years earlier. Elara's bravery not only saved her life, but also brought justice for another victim. Cale Mercer, the family man with a dark secret, was sentenced to life in prison. The town of Willow Creek slowly began to heal, but the scars remained. Elara, though forever changed by her ordeal, found strength in her survival. She went on to tell her story, using her voice to advocate for victims of crime and to remind others that, even in the darkest moments, hope and courage can prevail. Her journey from victim to survivor became a beacon of light, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The story of Elara Voss and Cale Mercer became a cautionary tale, one that reverberated far beyond the borders of Willow Creek. For Elara, life after the ordeal was a journey of healing and rediscovery. Though the scars, both physical and emotional, would never fully fade, she refused to let them define her. With the support of her family and the community, she channeled her pain into purpose, becoming an advocate for victims of abduction and violence. Her courage inspired countless others, and her story served as a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, the human spirit could endure and triumph. Cale Mercer's arrest and subsequent trial sent shockwaves through the town. The revelation that a seemingly ordinary family man could harbor such evil was a sobering reminder that monsters often hide in plain sight. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his conviction brought a measure of closure to the community, but it also left lingering questions about how someone like Cale could go unnoticed for so long. The case prompted a broader conversation about vigilance and the importance of listening to intuition, even when it challenges the image of those we think we know. Willow Creek, once a quiet town untouched by such horrors, was forever changed. The disappearance of Elara Voss and the unmasking of Cale Mercer left an indelible mark on its residents. But from the ashes of tragedy emerged a stronger, more united community. People became more aware, more connected, and more willing to look out for one another. Elara's survival became a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of never giving up. As the years passed, the story of Elara's escape and Cale's downfall continued to resonate. It was a reminder that evil could be confronted, that justice could be served, and that even in the darkest moments, light could prevail. Elara's journey was far from over, but she faced the future with a strength born of survival, determined to make her voice heard and to ensure that no one else would suffer as she had. Her story was not just one of tragedy, it was a story of triumph, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt lost in the shadows.